Hello everyone and welcome to Raisina Ideas Pod. We are on the third day now here at Raisina Dialogue, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation today with my two panelists. Welcome to New Delhi first and foremost. With me I have Ambassador Nicolai Ruge, who's a Special Representative for Maritime Security at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark. And I have Mr. Hans Christian Hagman, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, Head of the Office of Strategic Analysis and National Security Coordination at the Prime Minister's Office in Sweden. And we have a very interesting conversation now. Of course, a lot of, as we have discussed here over the past 2-3 days, conflict is a word that's the most commonly used in all rooms, in all conversations. But let's take it a little bit off land, so to speak. Let's take it to the seas. In general, my question first to Ambassador, you would be, we've seen sort of an increase of threats, specifically in the maritime domain, whether it's the Red Sea, it's the Indo-Pacific, there are a lot of contestations. But let's talk about Europe and the Indo-Pacific. That's a common theme here in New Delhi, at least. What do you see in general Europe's increasing role in the Indo-Pacific? And with that, as an associated question, China's role in the Indo-Pacific, and does Europe see it as a threat, or does Europe see it as something that it really needs to address in the time to come?
I think the basic point is that there's no doubt that Asia-Pacific is becoming more and more important for trade, for investments, and we have growing powers in the region. So the fact that we now see strategic competition shouldn't be any surprise. I think it's something we have to live with and find a way around and try to mitigate. And I think that's probably what the Europe and the EU in most cases would be able to do best, is to try and mitigate those kind of strategic competitions. And I think if you take it sort of down to a technical level and you focus on, you can say if it's the larger Asia-Pacific, the contestation is mainly between China and the US. If you look at the Indian Ocean, it's more India being concerned about the rise of China in the ocean. And I think EU and Europe has a role to play in trying to work not only with India but with all the littoral states around the Indian Ocean on trying to address their very tangible maritime security concerns. They may not always be sort of the high politics, but they can also be around illegal, unregulated fisheries, drugs, human trafficking, those kind of very tangible maritime security issues that they would like to have addressed. And the EU is, through various instruments and actions, already working with the littoral states. And I think that's a way of trying to build confidence and sort of lower the temperature in the Indian Ocean.
And that's very succinctly put. Let me do a very quick follow-up to that. We have been talking about threats around the Philippine Sea, for example. We've been talking about threats in the Indian Ocean, for example. When we're talking about, let's say, multilateralism, or there's a conversation around that multilateralism is on the downfall. It's the post-World War II order is sort of not working out. Does that mean that Europe's presence in these waters is going to, or is expected to increase as these gaps come into play, especially tactically, if not just strategically? And moving forward, will Europe have actually capacities to take on these multiple theater challenges that are coming our way?
No, there's definitely a real challenge that you're referring to because of the multiple theaters in play at the same time. But I'm quite convinced that you will see a strengthened EU presence in the region. I mean, it is a very important region. We've recently just have Commissioner von der Leyen, or President von der Leyen, and the entire Commission in Delhi. I think that's a strong signal of the commitment and interest. And I think also the Indo-Pacific strategy that EU put out in 21, which focus on the rule of law, strong partnerships. I think that is also what EU can bring to the table. It needs to stand by its value and work for a rules-based system, which in this case include the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. It is under threat in various places, in various ways. There are elements of it that can be debated and should always be debated, but I think it's important that the centrality of UNCLOS stands also in the Indian Ocean.
That's very interesting. Mr. Hagman, let me take this opportunity to move a little away from the Indo-Pacific. And the Arctic is something, for example, that's gaining interest in India, as odd as that may sound to your audiences specifically. What kind of role are you seeing developing in the Arctic? About a couple of years ago, we saw this entire sort of narrative of how it's going to be navigable. That means that security-wise, that is going to come up as a major issue. We saw the Chinese sort of start building icebreakers, calling themselves a near Arctic state. So moving forward, it's not a theater that's really in movement right now, but how do you see that developing as we see these fractures come into play in our multilateral world?
Well, thank you. May I just first start off by saying that both Sweden and Denmark, we are traders. Denmark has one of the biggest trading fleets, very big on shipping. So we view very much the world in flows. Predictability and security, stability is very important for the rationality of global flows. I think we tend to view the Arctic from that perspective as well. So far, we do not see any strategic flows, and that is simply because the high north, the Arctic, it's really bad weather. It is cold, it's dark half of the year, and it's light the other half of the year. It is expensive to transport goods through these icy waters. It is much more expensive to build ice capacity ships. They're much more expensive to propel because they're heavier. So the economics are not there yet. It may change in 10, 20, 30 years, but right now, when it's only passable for 3 to 4 months, it is not very much, very low volumes. Almost half of all the transports in the region is fishing. The rest is essentially to and from Russia, either with sustenance to Russian settlements, or it's transport of energy from Russia to, well, including China and others. So we're not seeing these strategic flows. It cannot be compared anywhere near to any of the strategic flows which we have in Malacca or Hormuz or Suez or whatever. It is very small today, and to be quite honest, I mean, the third largest kind of shipping is tourism and cruise ships. So we have to get this into proportion, and I would say that the Arctic is much more dramatic the further away you are from the Arctic. It is still very cold and difficult, and yes, there are fantastic natural resources there, but they are very deep and they're very difficult and expensive to extract. So maybe in the future, but for now, it is actually quite only a few countries who can extract resources, and it's mostly Western oil companies so far.
Yeah. And just very quickly to probe on one of the points that you raised, you know, the Arctic is also, a lot of people here may not know, but has its own very specific governance structures. You have worked with Russia very closely on how to sort of make it as safe as possible, at least previously. Are those ecosystems that were built over decades, considering the current prevailing situation, are they still holding? And if they're holding, is that a model for the future if multilateralism is being revisited? That, you know, it is possible that you can work with other powers that may not have the same interest as you do to make certain geographies and certain regions sort of safer, if not safe.
I think that is very true, and we have the neighbors we have, and we have the major stakeholders in the Arctic. Who has the largest territories? Well, number one, it's Canada. Number two, it's Russia. And then it's falling, and Norway and Denmark have considerable areas, exclusive economic zones, with great potential. But we have a working relationship. We have the Arctic Council since 1996, and there are 8 core members of this. But then we also have observers, where India is one of them, China is another, as is Singapore, as is Japan, as is the UK, Holland, and others, even Switzerland, to be quite honest. They're very well known for their navy. So we have an international cooperation arrangement, but very much of that is focused on environment, on sustainable development, but also indigenous populations, which is very part of the equation. And in those areas, we work quite well. And I think that rather have communication and know who your counterpart is. Just take Norway. They have a very deep and good understanding of the Russians. They are sharing a border with them, working with them on a daily basis. That does not mean that there is a love of their policies or an acceptance of their policies. For example, the war in Ukraine, which Russia started. But there's an understanding of your counterpart because you meet them on a daily basis across the border.
Ambassador, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just that historically Arctic used to be a low tension area. We are definitely trying to keep it that way, but being realistic, it is changing. I mean, we do see a military build up by Russia in the region, and we have to respond as well, and we do respond. We also see some steps taken by Russia to limit the freedom of navigation. Some of that can be within what is acceptable according to UNCLOS, others is not, and we are a little bit concerned about that, to put it.
So let me just ask you, UNCLOS is something that even India has had experiences with within its whole sort of maritime issues. Is that something that you see can survive these changing times of geopolitics as a mechanism that has sort of worked around resolving these maritime disputes specifically? And just to add to that, specifically when we are looking at an increased Chinese presence in most maritime theaters, not just one. You know, they both economically and geopolitically, they're a much bigger presence. And specifically, I'm presuming now in the Arctic, now that Russia and China are working much more closely than ever before. Is that a concern, or is that something that's been looked into from your perspective?
I think in terms of UNCLOS, I mean, you may come back and criticize me for being very optimistic in 5 or 10 years' time, but I think looking at it at this point in time, I think it will stand. I mean, there are so many global interests in what UNCLOS stands for, that even though elements of it is being challenged and can be debated and is constantly being discussed among legal scholars, I think it will stand because we all benefit from global trade, and the majority of global trade is transported on the high seas.
So, on the basis of sort of more powers, as you said, there's more interest in the Arctic as further away as you move from the Arctic. First, could you just very quickly quantify why that may be? Because usually we always hear about natural resources as being this big, almost sort of this gold rush kind of thing that is expected, and we've been hearing it for a long period of time. It's not new on the Arctic. Is there reality to it? Do you expect that kind of rush in a time when we are talking about a big change in how natural resources are being perceived when it comes to national security, both from a treaty point of view? You see with the US-Ukraine sort of how they are managing natural resources and mineral resources. Will that force a change in the Arctic? I mean, we may not envision it, but will that force a change on how these theaters are operated upon?
I think it's likely to be part of the change. I mean, there are plenty of natural resources in the high north, but they're also very difficult and complicated and expensive and environmentally risky to exploit. And we've seen that in Greenland, for instance, where there's been a lot of pushback on initiatives to do mining because of the environmental concerns and other concerns. So I don't think we will necessarily see a major rush. But that doesn't mean that the interest in the high north will evade and will go away. It will continue. And yes, we do also see an increased interest from China in the Arctic, and how that balance out between Russia, China, and Europe and other partners in the high north is going to be interesting to follow.
And so, just very quickly coming to you, Mr. Hagman, in general, how do you see maritime theatre specifically, from a European point of view, being a challenge for geoeconomics? We are seeing geoeconomics as almost trumping the word geopolitics many often, right? It comes first, and then of course geopolitics comes in, and of course there's association between the two. You can't deconflict both of them. But as economics becomes a much greater and much more integrated ecosystem, even in a world where we are challenging globalization, how does maritime security sort of feature in? And if the US is rethinking its role in the world, who is preparing to fill the gaps?
Now, I think, first of all, the US is not leaving the world stage. And just because we have a plateau of globalization, it's still at a very, very high level. Still, 90% of all goods are transported, as the ambassador said, on ship. So, yes, there will be disruptions with tariffs. Yes, there will be disruptions with protectionism. But a lot of the flows, a lot of the bulk will still continue more or less. We're not seeing stovepipes, we're not seeing silos. Maybe increased spheres, we will see some duplication. We will have different cloud services in different areas. We will have certain internal production, for example, especially in sensitive materials or sensitive components. That is the case, and that's an irrationality in the greater. But I do not see a huge shift. No country is pulling out of China entirely. 120 countries have China as their biggest trading partner still, even with all of the talk and rhetoric of de-risking and decoupling. And even India has China as its almost largest trading partner, now second largest trading partner. So we are all into this together, more or less. But I do see maritime security becoming more important in the future, and it may become more difficult to have control of the high seas, not least when we talk about counter-piracy or terrorist activities, things like this, which we need to control the seas, just as we've done for hundreds of years. And who will do that? Will we have coalitions? Who will participate in, I'm thinking of Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, for example, that it is more expensive to take the ships around Africa rather than to take the shortest route.
Sure.
So, but you need to raise the costs considerably in order for it to be worth the risks of taking it through the Arctic, for example. We shouldn't forget that it is expensive to do that. The reliability of the Russians is not perhaps always there. We are dependent on Russian lighthouses, Russian search and rescue capacities. These things, they're not entirely inviting and not commercially viable. And that's not just the extraction, but also the flows of goods.
Right.
It's not there yet.
Right.
But in general, I do see maritime security becoming more important and less self-evident than it was when the US Navy, and before that the Royal Navy, ruled the seas.
Ambassador, let me come to you for the final question of our time, since we are running out. Just very quickly, 3 points in your view when it comes to both maritime security, as Mr. Hagman highlighted, this is going to be a big challenge, issue, and opportunity at the same time. And sort of from your vantage point, how do you see these maritime theaters that are coming up in a very patchy manner, almost disrupting, as we talked about, forcing trade to go one way or the other way. The Malacca issue was always highlighted as a problem. So was the Strait of Hormuz. But now there are many more that seem to be there. Is that challenge, are we prepared to address those challenges? Or it is going to take a level of disruption, as we mentioned, to force that change to come into play?
I think if we look at challenges to maritime security, I mean, they're definitely increasing. We have in Denmark just recently put out a new global strategy on maritime security, which exactly tries to look at the entire spectrum of challenges against maritime security. And it's not only piracy, far from it. That was the focus 10, 15 years ago. Now it's increasingly about semi-states powers, like what we experience in the Red Sea with the Houthis attacking commercial ships. I mean, that's something brand new, and it's a total different kind of threat that takes a different level of response, as we have seen by US-led and EU-led naval operations in the Red Sea. In terms of the different theaters, I think we are not quite prepared. There's a lot of work going on trying to improve maritime domain awareness in the different seas. It's a bit of a patchwork. I think the Indian Ocean is a good example of that. There are different organizations and different networks that try to do this, and I think we need to work on integrating some of those platforms where you exchange information about what is happening at the high seas and give all the states around that those eyes on the sea through the maritime domain awareness, as we call it.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, challenges all over. The challenge is over, but within those, I hope you find opportunities. So thank you so much for your time, Ambassador Ruge, Mr. Hagman, and thank you all for watching.